Statement of the Communist Party of Canada Marxist-Leninist on the anniversary of the U.S.-NATO proxy war in Ukraine. All out to demand that Canada get out of NATO and that NATO be dismantled. Let us together make Canada a zone for peace. As we complete 1 year of the U.S.-NATO proxy war in Ukraine, the Communist Party of Canada Marxist-Leninist salutes all those across the country and around the world who are opposing the U.S.-NATO proxy war and calling for peaceful resolution to the conflict. CPCML calls on Canadian citizens and residents, Indigenous peoples, and the people of Quebec to demand Canada get out of NATO and for NATO to be dismantled. Let us together fight for an anti-war government in this country that makes Canada a zone for peace. During this past year, Canada has participated in this U.S.-NATO proxy war by promoting disinformation to disorient Canadians. It helped organize the neo-Nazi Banderite forces in the Ukraine, elevated them to positions of power, and promoted their Nazi slogans. It has provided them with training and organization and helped to integrate them into the Ukrainian forces and special forces, which Canada denies. It has hidden the crimes they have committed and participated in the war by supplying weapons and money to the government of Ukraine, put in place through coup d'etat that Canada played no small part in instigating. Canada has given preferential treatment to Ukrainian refugees, while refugees and migrant workers from other countries are treated with disdain. All of it has been done in the name of peace and humanitarian aid, even as Canada engages in hooligan activity at the United Nations and in international fora and blocks a negotiated solution. Every day it announces more crimes that it is committing based on the NATO declaration that the only solution is to defeat Russia on the battlefield and to crush it once and for all. The government and its so-called intelligence agencies, legacy and social media at its disposal, cartel parties, the parliament and legislatures all engage in massive amounts of disinformation to disorient the people's thinking on the Ukraine conflict. Nonetheless, reality prevails, not the ruler's version of reality. All over the world on this anniversary, demonstrations are taking place, along with protest marches against the anti-social offensives which accompany the increased spending on the U.S.-NATO proxy war in Ukraine, sanctions against Russia, and repressive measures. In Canada, information pickets and rallies are taking place across the country, and polls confirm that more Canadians oppose the U.S.-NATO proxy war than even a few months ago. The crimes the U.S. is committing and is embroiling its allies to commit are extensive, and it is promising an escalation of the war. With the collapse of the former Soviet Union 30 years ago, the hegemony of two superpowers over global affairs was ended. The peoples of the world expected peace, freedom, democracy, and human rights. All they got is the U.S. striving for world hegemony, declaring itself the indispensable nation. Its crimes increased on an unprecedented scale. It started pitting its so-called rules-based international order against the international rule of law sanctioned by the United Nations and its founding charter. On the basis of intrigues and cartels and its own financial institutions to entangle the entire world under its hegemony, it established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, as an aggressive military alliance, carried out assassinations of progressive leaders and coup d'etat and wars of aggression against any country that refused to submit. What is important to take stock of at this time is that despite all the crimes committed against them, it is the peoples who have prevailed. They have suffered tremendously at the hands of the U.S. and its allies, but it has never been weapons that have decided the outcome of the conflicts taking place. It has been and continues to be the peoples fighting for their sovereignty, for what belongs to them by right and their right to be. Today, behind all the disinformation and U.S.-NATO threats to obliterate countries that refuse to submit to their hegemony, and that they will even unleash nuclear war and blame others, what we see is the U.S., Canada, Britain, and NATO countries drowning in their own warmongering, anti-social offensives, and police powers. We see the peoples fighting everywhere to bring about the solutions that favor them. While it may look like the US and its war allies have not been held to account, the developments are settling scores with what they stand for and what they are doing, independent of their will, despite their wishes or what they think of themselves. The clash between the conditions and authority are urging the peoples to step up the fight at this time for what belongs to them by right, for human-centered forms of governance, and to make their countries zones for peace, freedom, and democracy.
All over the world, the fight between the old and the new is raging, taking different forms based on the conditions which exist and the level of collective consciousness which is expressing itself. The peoples of the world see, live, and suffer the crimes the US and its allies continue to commit, and they are rising against regimes which commit such crimes. Canada plays a heinous role as an appeaser of the US, an accomplice which commits crimes of its own. The crimes include the theft of lands and resources, the use of force and mistreatment of refugees, migrants, the working people, indigenous peoples, crimes against nature and against all those who are fighting for their rights. It foments disinformation, enforces illegal sanctions, funds and arms counter-revolutionary factions, and organizes to commit crimes and carry out regime change in African countries, Syria, Latin America, and the Caribbean, including by recently sending warships to Haiti. It continues to harbor abuse of women even though it claims to champion their rights at home and abroad. It enforces a constitution which discriminates against all working people, national minorities, against indigenous treaties and hereditary rights, the rights of the people of Quebec to self-determination, and against all those whose choices and identities cry out for recognition and who are fighting for their right to be. The US and the countries which appease it, such as Canada and the former European colonial powers, are causing untold suffering for their own peoples and the peoples everywhere. This is a fact. It is the visible, tangible reality. Despite all the talk of the rulers that the measures they are taking are for peace, freedom, and democracy, and that they will improve the situation, on every front, things are getting worse by leaps and bounds. In response, the peoples are fighting. This too is a fact. They are laying their claims on what belongs to them by right, speaking out in their own name, and striving to find solutions which favor them. They are showing their internationalist spirit, supporting resistance, and lending a hand to all those fighting for rights. Furthermore, entire countries are also taking stands based on their own interests, which they see served by upholding solutions based on international rule of law, not the US hegemonic so-called rules-based international order, which Canada also promotes. The US and its coterie of NATO allies are isolated within the United Nations General Assembly, and the new formations which are being brought forward to conduct trade relations as well as guarantee security and engage in financial transactions and relations which are not subject to US dollar hegemony or the brutal sanctions regimes, nuclear blackmail, as well as the sufferings of mass famines, droughts, deforestation, and consequences of climate change on humans and nature. 1 year after the start of the US-NATO proxy war in Ukraine, the US, Canada, and big powers of old Europe, their security advisors and intelligence agencies at the highest levels, are taking frenzied measures to achieve their dishonorable aim of crushing Russia. They are deploying extensive resources to execute what the warmongering alliance says are next steps. Despite manipulated resolutions presented at the United Nations, the majority of the countries of the world are not siding with the US-NATO war alliance. They have other plans, which are revealing themselves as they seek solutions to the crisis which save humankind from the Armageddon the US-NATO forces hold in store. A great reckoning is taking place. The majority of countries and the peoples of the world reject the so-called rules-based international order which the US gave rise to after World War II for purposes of fighting communism and imposing its hegemony on Europe and dominating Asia while keeping Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean in check. They did this on the basis of creating secret services comprised of former Nazi SS conducting assassinations of progressive leaders, coups d'etats, and brutal wars of aggression, along with imposing their so-called liberal democratic institutions to make sure the people's striving for empowerment was thwarted. But today, all of this is in crisis because might does not make right or sort out what human beings want. Human beings cannot be brought under control by using force or being discarded as things on a scrap heap. Furthermore, the striving of countries big and small to make the international rule of law enshrined in the United Nations and its charter prevail is expressing itself in the course of seeking solutions which favor them. This is the case no matter the political or ideological forms of rule or persuasion of the countries which seek to affirm their sovereignty, which the US and its NATO allies say is a thing of the past. While the rulers are strengthening governments of police powers in the name of the nation, its economy, security, anachronistic liberal democratic institutions, and a so-called rules-based order, countries are coming forward to defend their sovereignty. Peoples are strengthening their striving to find human-centered solutions which affirm their right to be and empower themselves by bringing human-centered anti-war governments into being. On the first anniversary of the war in Ukraine, the situation harbors serious dangers for humankind. But humankind is sure to prevail. It is the people striving for peace, freedom, and democracy, and their participation in turning things around in their favor, which is the decisive factor, not weapons, not defunct institutions, which call themselves liberal democratic, not anachronistic constitutions, which created a fictitious person of state to rule above the people and deprive them of the decision-making power which belongs to them by right. It is the people's internationalist spirit, striving for fraternal relations of mutual benefit with nations big and small, whose sovereignty must be protected, and the peoples organizing for progress in their own countries and supporting the same abroad that defend the interests of humanity. The most important challenge of our time is the crying need to forge a collective consciousness that favors the peoples by uniting in action in opposition to the deadly path of the US-NATO war alliance. All out to demand that Canada get out of NATO and that NATO be dismantled. Not a single youth for imperialist war. All out to make Canada a zone for peace.